are very excited to take you through Active Directory. Commvault spent a lot of time building this product. We think it's wonderful, and we know that you guys will as well. One of the questions we're going to ask ourselves today is, could you fully recover your Active Directory in the event of a cyber resiliency event? Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping. Feel free to ask questions throughout. The chat will be monitored, so we'll get to your questions just as soon as we can. Check out our recommended content. There's a lot of good content that our team has built for you, easily shareable. Please interact with us on social media as well. So on X or Instagram, Facebook, or wherever flavor you have today. Ask for help. If there's any questions that you have there, please hit the chat button there. And then lastly, we hope you all will book a demo with us. Dan will show you a quick demo of the product today. But most importantly, we'd love to have you get your hands on it and see it more intimately with your account team. So please hit that button and book a demo before the end of the recording. Today's hosts, myself, Mike Odisho. I am the America SaaS Director for Emerging Technology for Commvault.
I'm Dan Conrad from the Field CTO team at Commvault. I have 25 plus years experience in Active Directory, and I can say that because it is now 2025 and Active Directory has been around for 25 years. So feel free to ask questions, Active Directory questions during the session or after the session, or reach out to me on LinkedIn. Happy to have Active Directory discussions with you.
Awesome. We're really lucky to have Dan with the company as one of our principal technologists for the field here. Dan was very instrumental in helping guide the product to where it is today, and we're super excited to take you through that. So today's objectives, we're going to handle three things. First, we're going to discuss the evolution of AD attacks and the challenges of rebuilding AD. Second, we're going to explore why AD is one of the most targeted applications, and why does it make sense to have a singular cyber resiliency platform to protect your organization. And then lastly, Dan's going to demonstrate how Commvault enables cyber recovery of AD and Entra ID that accelerates your return to work. So let's get to it.
So let's talk for a minute about Active Directory attacks. I look at four specific timelines or four specific events in the timeline of Active Directory and the attacks. I think back to 2012. I think most of us remember the attack on Target and the events that happened. Most of these events had effects on large populations of people. So when the Target attack happened, that affected every customer of Target. So what happened was an external entity had a trust relationship that managed part of Target's mechanical infrastructure. So they were able to authenticate to their own Active Directory, but reach into Target and do certain things. That external entity was breached, and the attackers rode that trust relationship into Target and used that opportunity to install malware on point-of-sale machines. That gave them access to credit card data. I was affected by that. Actually, my wife's credit card was affected by that. We received notification, certain things happened. After that was the Sony Pictures attack. So sort of the same thing. It wasn't, it was all about taking data or suspending data or even destroying data in some cases. In between here was the Office of Personnel Management in the US was attacked by a foreign entity. That was their Active Directory was breached, and that compromised a large database of security clearance information for federal employees for the US government. All three of those attacks were data related. The attacker got into the environment, they saw the data, they took the data, they used it for their own means, they sold it on the dark web. Which sounds very scary, right? But once your credit card is compromised, most of us change that credit card information. It doesn't matter. The credit card companies may have been affected by that by actually having to pay out claims against it, but the effect on the consumer was not intense. But then you get into the concept of instead of just taking the data or even destroying the data, like would have happened in the Sony Pictures incident, you get into Maersk and Colonial Pipeline, where instead of taking data and profiting from it, if they didn't really have the data or didn't understand how they could profit from it, they would just shut down the entire network and hold it hostage. This is sort of the evolution of ransomware. When they realize simply being in the network, I own your entire infrastructure, you have to pay me to recover it. Maersk was an Active Directory breach. Colonial Pipeline was an Active Directory breach. We could examine the pieces or the parts of the security infrastructure that were compromised and what led to the breach. But at the bottom line, you're going to get to the point where you think you have all your bases covered, and you really don't. There's going to be breaches, there's going to be 0 days, there's going to be attack methods that organizations use or that attackers use that we're not even aware of, and they still happen. So, things like multi-factor authentication are critical, but preventing privilege escalation is really the big piece. What Mike and I are here to talk about today is what happens when all of this goes wrong. I've got all my controls in place. I've done everything that's recommended by every organization to protect my directory, and something still goes wrong. We've heard the phrase, consider them, they're always in the walls. They're already in the walls. What do you do when the attacker actually compromises your Active Directory? I spent a lot of time through the years doing Active Directory recovery for granular things. Somebody deleted an OU, and maybe even an admin took malicious activity against Active Directory. Usually it was a mistake by an admin with elevated privileges, but that's sort of table stakes now. We don't really worry too much about recovering at a granular level. Although commvault does that as well, the solutions do that, it's very easy to do. We're really focused on the enterprise class destruction. As we know, if you're an Active Directory person on this call, you know Active Directory is very resilient in itself, in that any single domain controller fails, it doesn't really affect your Active Directory, or it shouldn't. So we want to get into what happens when all of Active Directory goes down at the same time.
Yeah, gosh, that sounds scary, Dan, because really the bad guys only have to get it right once, and you've got to get it right all the time. So it's our opinion that Active Directory is the keystone application to your company, right? You authenticate it in everything, from whether you go to your front door to the office to scan your key card to get into the office, to your corporate communications and how you communicate to one another. Is everything's affected to that, to sales reps that need to log into Salesforce to be able to do their jobs. So it is the cornerstone application that really ties everything together. Now, being that it's that important, 9 out of 10 attacks target AD now. The reason why is because over 600 million users of AD are out there right now, and per Microsoft Digital Defense, 60-some% of those users are unprotected. So there's no wonder why the bad guys are going to where they seem where the opportunity is, which is really scary. Of those attacks, some 40% are successful. So you might as well flip a coin to figure out if you're going to get hit or not, and have an event to where you potentially may have to pay. Not odds that I want to put my company in. So what does that mean? It just means that now 88% of your customers are being impacted, had insecure AD configuration. This is why commvault's stepping into this space to do what we've always done for the last 27 years, is protect enterprise corporations to ensure that they can protect themselves in the event of a disaster and cybersecurity event. Once they get in, though, here's where the scary part comes. If that wasn't scary enough, it's only an hour and 42 minutes before they start going laterally, which means that's when they start to do the most damage. So now partnering with commvault can help you accelerate recovery in a matter of minutes, as opposed to having no protection, having to figure out how to pull back everybody, whether that was from a cybersecurity event or just an internal mess up where you may have accidentally deleted something and you now have to spend hours upon weeks upon months rebuilding something. And believe me, I've heard the horror stories about that. So Dan, when someone gets in, what happens?
Well, I've been in organizations where, we can look at the root cause, right? The root cause of the problem, even in something like an accidental deletion. Active Directory is, we've got Kerberos tickets and we've got hashes and things like that that keep us authenticating. So if I'm logged into Active Directory and we call them knowledge workers, and I'm doing my thing day to day, and my account gets deleted from Active Directory, it's not like I instantly stop. It's not a mainframe. We're all logged into the same console and everybody gets kicked out. It's not like that. I'll have a Kerberos ticket that's valid for up to 90 minutes, and I may be affected immediately. I may not. When we see Active Directory disappear like that, it's sort of a wake-up call. Like something just happened. How do I fix it? Let me put that back. But when you're talking about catastrophic Active Directory recovery, you have on the slide here sort of a dwell time. 1 hour and 42 minutes. We've heard dwell times where attackers may be in the organization for up to a year before they exploit anything. If I'm an Active Directory attacker, you got to consider two things. First off, Active Directory is going to be the target of the attack. because I know that if I compromise Active Directory and shut it down, it shuts the organization down. But Active Directory may have also been the attack vector, where the privileges and the credentials and the authentication within Active Directory may have been how the user or how the attacker got in the first place. So when we're looking at that, we want to realize that how is this going to affect the users? If I'm an Active Directory attacker, I'm going to elevate my privileges as fast as possible. I'm going to get to that domain admin credential, and then I'm most likely going to deploy group policy. Again, if you're an Active Directory person on the call today, you understand how group policy works, but it's, think about setting your wallpaper on your desktop at a corporate level. That's an interesting thing you can do it with group policy. I can also deploy software with group policy, and I can link it anywhere in Active Directory. So if I take my malware payload and I put it in a share and I decide to deploy it to the enterprise, every machine that's joined to Active Directory as a member of that domain is going to apply that group policy within 90 minutes. So as long as they're connected to the domain controllers, that means I can own every domain connected machine within a 90-minute period. So it's a little bit scary when you think about how they actually do it.
Yeah, that is scary, Dan. Well, let's talk about the platform. Dan and I have been on hundreds of calls since we've announced the release of AD Standard, and now that AD Enterprise is coming out for us as well, we're super excited. But the majority of those calls have all been angled around security. Typically, security within the walls of our customers are coming and say, hey, look, we've realized that AD is not being protected, and we have to go protect it. And that's stemming out of some other sort of investment that they're looking in their environment on of, okay, well, if AD is not, then what else isn't protected in our environment? And how do we look at security as an overall company? So it's plugging into a much larger conversation for a lot of our customers, which plays perfectly into the platform aspect, because we said earlier is when you have point products, that just means you have more people managing more things. That complicates the recovery, which means that the whole idea of recovering is to make it as short as possible and not as complicated and as long as possible. So the platform itself that we offer is completely differentiated and, in our opinion, very seamlessly put together from a user experience. Now, commvault's been in the game for quite some time now, as you know, and we have some of the broadest workload coverages. And the reason why we think this is a unique platform for commvault is because we have access to a lot of the data, so we have unique insights into what's happening with the data. So much so that we have early anomaly detection. We actually do anomaly detection before we move your data into the backup environment. We also have early warning cyber deception tools out there to figure out what's going on in the terms of honeypots. So if that lure goes down in the water, there are no false positives, you are being attacked. So we have a lot of different tools to actually scan the data before we actually move it back into what we're going to talk about here in a clean room, which is an industry first product that we came out with. But before you can get into clean room, you have to have a virtual air-gapped copy of that data that is outside of your own tenant. And that's where our AGP, Air Gap Protect, comes into play. So as you move your data from on-prem, we scan it to make sure that there's nothing bad in the data itself, and then we move it over to our air gap. Now we give you the ability to actually pull back in an environment of what we call clean room. Now, a couple of things that's unique about clean room. One, it's an environment that never existed before, so therefore it cannot be compromised. Two, you can run forensics on your data to make sure that when you have to pull back from your from an event, from a cyber event, you have to have confidence that your data is not corrupted. Sometimes we get wind where customers will tend to want to recover in a very expeditious manner, and ends up what happening is they reinfect themselves because they don't know what data is good and what data is bad. What clean room recovery does in this area is allows you to actually run forensics on your data to ensure that the actual data that you're going to come back from is actually good data. Now, how do you do that? Well, we're one of the few companies that allow you to actually practice this at least quarterly throughout the year. There's a lot of prohibitions to be able to recover your data, but the tabletop exercises just don't go as far enough that we feel. You actually have to practice it, whether that's a random day, taking people, pulling them out of position, and then saying now we have to recover because they may not be there. You can actually practice for all scenarios throughout the year. So now all of a sudden when the event does happen, you should be fully prepared for a 360 review to be able to pull your data back in an event that happens. Dan, anything else to add here before we move to the next slide?
The clean room recovery is very critical. We talked about this before, right, Mike, where if you're going to recover a business critical application, you can recover it to clean room, But if that business critical application is dependent on Active Directory, you need to recover Active Directory to clean room as well.
All right, now let's take a look at the platform. Dan's going to walk you through our AD with Microsoft Entra AD Backup.
So we're really talking about, let's talk 3 levels of backup, even though we have 2 on the screen here. We're talking about Active Directory backup, both granular and forest level. So Mike mentioned a couple of things. The big piece of that would be air gap protect. If you're backing up Active Directory and storing it on-prem, maybe that's in an isolated storage facility. Maybe it's in something that can't be modified after the fact. But wouldn't it be great if you had a guarantee that it was going to be protected and modified, or unmodified? So that's where air gap protect comes in. So as we back up Active Directory, we can take an additional copy of that backup and store it in our air gap protect solution that gives you this immutable storage copy of your backup. So when you go to recover, you know that it's going to be valid. We've seen instances where Active Directory recovery, on-prem Active Directory recovery, was encrypted by attackers prior to actually being able to even use it. Then you get into Entra ID backup. Entra ID backup, by default, goes up to our cloud solution. So if you're backing up Entra ID, it's a cloud solution, back it up to a cloud solution. So you get very rapid recovery from that. And if you're going to recover to cloud, so if you, like Mike mentioned, the clean room as well, that's groundbreaking technology within commvault, where I don't have to have an isolated part of my network always available to recover to. This can be an on-demand clean room that you practice your recovery to. Whether you do it once a month might be a little bit excessive to do a forest level recovery, but quarterly would be a great exercise to actually run through your run books and make sure your Active Directory is recoverable. If that's in the air gap protect and you recover to clean room, that's going to be a quicker recovery for you. So let's take a look at the solutions here. So with 2 versions of commvault Cloud Backup and Recovery for Active Directory, we call the Standard Edition and the Enterprise Edition. We call AD Standard and AD Enterprise. The Standard Edition, all of the standard things that we do with recovering Active Directory and Entra ID. So if somebody deletes an OU full of users, we can put that back. If somebody deletes conditional access policies out of Entra ID, you can easily restore that with all the relationships that go with that. AD groups are a big thing that get modified. You can run comparison reports on before and after values of user objects. If you've got somebody that's a really good PowerShell scripter in your environment, you can run comparison reports of before and after values. I know from experience having the ability to recover at the attribute level is very valuable when you need to make mass changes or you're going through something organizationally. Somebody writes a script to modify Active Directory, you want to have that ability to undo that script, and that's what the granular recovery does for you. You get into the enterprise class recovery. We're talking a Microsoft native forest recovery. If you've ever looked at the forest recovery guide from Microsoft, it used to be this 85-page document that you could see a start and a finish. Now it's web links. So I always keep it open on my desktop because I'm referencing it very frequently. But there's a lot of complicated tasks in there that are simply a web link. When you click into this, you realize that there's a huge amount of work underneath that. What we're doing is we're taking that native recovery, that Microsoft recommended forest recovery guide, adding some commvault features and functions to that, like being able to reset admin credentials and things like that as part of your forest recovery. And then we're automating that. So, a forest recovery is not something you're going to do from the beach, like you did. If somebody deleted an OU full of users, you may pop it open your laptop and you can put the OU full of users back. But if somebody, if your forest has been compromised, you're probably not going to do it, sitting on the beach with your feet up watching the waves come in. It's still going to be an event you're going to want to pay a lot of attention to. But we're going to automate those steps for you. And as we automate those steps, if there's anything in that process, in that runbook that you want to skip over or accelerate, you can actually interact with the runbook live while it's running.
Very cool steps, Dan. Why don't you take us through a demo?
So this is the cloud control plane for commvault. You can see you've got control of pretty much all of your work, your backup and recovery, your data protection workloads from this control plane. And Active Directory is right here at the top. Somebody pointed this out to me the other day that it's actually alphabetical. I thought it was just a very high priority for the company, but I'm going to use it to my advantage here. Within this control plane, we've got 3 types of Active Directory recovery. We've got your granular Active Directory recovery, where I can recover multiple forests, multiple domains, and objects within those from a granular perspective. I have my Enter ID recovery as well. So if I wanted to recover users, groups, conditional access policies, all of that stuff within Enter ID, I can do that here as well. But today we're here to talk about forest recovery. So I go to my forest tab up here. In this world, I have two forests that I'm protecting with my control plane. I've got my Mega Brew company. This is my fictitious company that I haven't decided if it's coffee or beer, and it might be both. So I can take a look at my backups from here. First thing we're going to do is we're going to discover your Active Directory environment, and I can show the domain controllers here. This gives me a good view of my parent-child relationship of domains and how many domain controllers I have and things like that. It gives me a list of the domain controllers on the right, and I can come into the DCs and I can take a look at the properties, and I can see things like FSMO role holders and their IP addresses and their operating system versions and things like that. This is the parent domain. So you can see right here that domain looks very important to the Active Directory because it contains all the FSMO roles. And then I start to look at the child domains as well. I can see everything. This one's got all of the domain level FSMO roles. So you might want to consider recovering those. It's not absolutely necessary to just recover FSMO roles. When we have the domain discovered, based on this information that we have, you're going to build a run book. So a run book would be something for a production recovery, something for an isolated network recovery. Let's take a look at the isolated network recovery here. Sort of the same view, but then we've got all of our run book steps right here. So if you've ever been through or even looked at the Microsoft document on forest level recovery, you know you have to recover the root domain first. So that's what we're going to do. So megabrew.lab is my root domain, and then I'm going to recover prod.megabrew.lab. But within these steps, I have many sub-steps. So I've got a manual step here where it's going to pause and ask me if I'm sure I want to recover. I can skip through that. But then we're going to recover the first domain controller in the domain. So we're going to walk through this. We're going to create a new domain controller from backup. We're going to install the latest commvault updates, that kind of thing. Child my control plane recovery, where you've got control of pretty much all of your work you want to pay a lot of attention to. But we're going to automate those steps for you. And as we automate those steps, if there's anything in that process, in that run book that you want to skip over or accelerate, you can actually interact with the run book live while it's running.
Very cool steps, Dan. Why don't you take us through a demo?
So this is the cloud control plane for commvault. You can see you've got control of pretty much all of your work, your backup and recovery, your data protection workloads from this control plane. And Active Directory is right here at the top. Somebody pointed this out to me the other day that it's actually alphabetical. I thought it was just a very high priority for the company, but I'm going to use it to my advantage here. Within this control plane, we've got three types of Active Directory recovery. We've got your granular Active Directory recovery, where I can recover multiple forests, multiple domains, and objects within those from a granular perspective. I have my Enter ID recovery as well. So if I wanted to recover users, groups, conditional access policies, all of that stuff within Enter ID, I can do that here as well. But today we're here to talk about forest recovery. So I go to my forest tab up here. In this world, I have two forests that I'm protecting with my control plane. I've got my Mega Brew company. This is my fictitious company that I haven't decided if it's coffee or beer, and it might be both. So I can take a look at my backups from here. First thing we're going to do is we're going to discover your Active Directory environment, and I can show the domain controllers here. This gives me a good view of my parent-child relationship of domains and how many domain controllers I have and things like that. It gives me a list of the domain controllers on the right, and I can come into the DCs and I can take a look at the properties, and I can see things like FSMO role holders and their IP addresses and their operating system versions and things like that. This is the parent domain. So you can see right here that domain looks very important to the Active Directory because it contains all the FSMO roles. And then I start to look at the child domains as well. I can see everything. This one's got all of the domain level FSMO roles. So you might want to consider recovering those. It's not absolutely necessary to just recover FSMO roles. When we have the domain discovered, based on this information that we have, you're going to build a run book. So a run book would be something for a production recovery, something for an isolated network recovery. Let's take a look at the isolated network recovery here. Sort of the same view, but then we've got all of our run book steps right here. So if you've ever been through or even looked at the Microsoft document on forest level recovery, you know you have to recover the root domain first. So that's what we're going to do. So megabrew.lab is my root domain, and then I'm going to recover prod.megabrew.lab. But within these steps, I have many sub-steps. So I've got a manual step here where it's going to pause and ask me if I'm sure I want to recover. I can skip through that. But then we're going to recover the first domain controller in the domain. So we're going to walk through this. We're going to create a new domain controller from backup. We're going to install the latest commvault updates, that kind of thing. Once that DC is up and running, we're going to do things like seize the FSMO roles, raise the RID pool. These are right out of the Microsoft Forest Level Recovery Guide. You get down into global catalog functionality. But let's go ahead and kick off a forest restore here. So from here, Mike mentioned cleanroom. Mike, if you want to talk for a second about cleanroom right here, this is how it applies to Active Directory is very unique.
Yeah, sure thing. So what Dan's walking through right now is the fact that you have an event and you're trying to figure out like where the blast radius is. If you can't trust your environment, then where do you actually try to recover to? Not necessarily from, right? Because you need to have copies of your data in a different tenant. Cleanroom gives you the ability to be able to pull this data into an environment that, again, has never existed before, so therefore can't be compromised. So when you have an event, you call commvault up, we give you the keys to this area, you spin it up, and then now all of a sudden you have a clean room to be able to recover into. And Active Directory can be part of that, right? So Danny, you were mentioning something where, well, if you can't get access to Active Directory and you can't go into an area to which you can trust to recover that data, then what do? You're kind of stuck a little bit, right?
Yeah, if you can't authenticate, if you're sort of stuck. Like if we were talking about critical enterprise applications in one of those previous slides. If you can recover the application but you can't authenticate, what's the point? So that's one of the options we can recover to. I also have the option for a test network or an isolated. Now, when you're doing Active Directory Forest recoveries, be sure if you're going to do a testing, make sure this network is truly isolated. Never accidentally recover a domain controller or a forest that can talk to your existing forest like you would do in a production forest recovery. So today I'm going to run this version right here. We want to make sure that this is sort of the are you sure? Then I can choose domain controllers I want to recover. I could say, give me all the domain controllers. In this case, I'm going to an isolated network, so I'll just get a domain controller from each domain, and that'll give me a functional forest. Now, if I don't recover all the domain controllers, the runbook and the workflow that happens will actually do a metadata cleanup, so Active Directory feels very healthy when it's recovered. And then, of course, if you want to go to production with that, you can take it to production. You can build more domain controllers from there. This has given me a point in time to choose my backup. So the last time my backup run, I can go back to next Friday or last Friday and recover from there. That's fine. I'm going to put in some credentials to recover the forest. So in this one, the forest root, I'm going to need a specific credential for that forest root. I've got an account in there that will work for me. And then I submit that, and then I add a credential in here into my child domain. You can see some other credentials in here. That's because I have multiple forests that are able to be recovered, and I could recover them simultaneously. So this is the term VME. So what I'm going to do here, when I set up my forest recovery, I told it to create virtual machines out of my system state backups. So I've had backups for all these domain controllers. If I want to back them all up, that's one thing. I don't necessarily need to recover all domain controllers. If you've ever been through a forest recovery, if you have 100 domain controllers, you might recover 20 of them and then have Active Directory up and running, and then you just rebuild domain controllers at ease. So you get yourself to a minimum viable product out, get Active Directory functioning before you start adding more DCs to it. You don't circle back and recover more. You just simply do Active Directory to a clean OS. Okay, so now let's configure the VME options. So these two machines are going to be pulled out of backup and virtualized. So I'll just select all of them and I'll give them all the same options. I'm going to send these out to Hyper-V because I have it and it's free. And I'm going to, when I build the machines, I'm going to put a tag on the front of them of HV dash so I can differentiate them from the rest of my machines in commvault, in the control plane, because it will set them up for backup and recovery as well. I'm going to put it on the isolated network on that Hyper-V host. I'm going to put a subnet mask in. And this can be decided on the fly as you do your recovery. So it gives you versatility in how you do your recoveries. So I'm going to give it a default gateway, even though this is an isolated network and the machines technically can't talk outside that network. My production network or my lab network typically operates on 192.168.10. I'm simply isolating everything over onto the 100 network. Now I'm ready to start the recovery. I'm going to choose this recovery node. So now I have a runbook. This runbook is actually what's going to execute for me. I showed you this before, but this is the actual, going to be the running runbook for me. So we're going to recover the parent domain, and I'm going to skip the manual step where it pauses and asks me, am I sure I want to recover? I've got a couple of options here to reset all admin passwords. I don't want to do that here, but you may want to do that in your network. And then reset all the user passwords. If you've been compromised, your admin credentials have been compromised, you may want to. And then after that, it's going to jump over to the prod. We're probably not going to sit here and watch the full forest recovery, but we're going to kick it off and see how far it gets. Again, you have to type forest recovery. So if you get this far and you've accidentally recovered your forest, it's very specific. So now we're going to look at the runbook as it's executing. So what I usually do is I grab my browser. This is the live view from the browser, and I'll drag it to the side over here. And then I'll put my Hyper-V view on the right. And Mike's seen me do this a few times. So what we're going to watch for is we're watching for the steps running in the runbook. So we started on the parent domain. We're restoring this DC right here. And these are the steps. So as soon as it gets to this step right here, we're going to see a domain controller or a virtual machine pop up on the right, and it's going to start to recover. You can see as the steps are here running, if I wanted to skip, the commvault updates, I can toggle that off as long as it's before the step actually starts. So for instance, I know I have all the FSMO roles on a single domain controller that's going to be recovered. If I wanted to, not seize the FSMO roles, that's really not going to do anything in this step. It still executes just fine, but I don't really need to do that. And then I've skipped the steps to reset all the admin passwords. Now we can see we've got a domain controller that popped up on the right, and it will start the recovery process. So this is using my system state backup of a domain controller and giving me full control over the recovery right now. The first one's going to take a little bit of time, so about more time than we have today, but it's going to be about a 30-minute recovery for the first virtual machine. And then moving forward, things will move much quicker because we don't have to reaccomplish some of the same forest level tasks over and over again. And then once you have your domains or all the DCs recovered, if something were to go wrong with one of these recoveries, say for instance your Hyper-V server goes offline or something like that, any of these or individual tasks can actually be paused. You can suspend the runbook while it's running, go fix the problem, restart the Hyper-V service, whatever it would be, and then come back and restart the runbook or even reaccomplish the same task over again and then move forward. With the Microsoft recovery recommendations, certain things have to be done in a certain order, and that's the way these are set up to be done. So, of course, you can't invalidate the RID pool before you raise the RID pool, so keep these in order. But everything else, for the most part, you can have full control over your recovery as it's actually running. If you get down into some of the more complicated stuff, if you have DNS running on something other than Active Directory in DNS, you can pause right here, When this finishes in about an hour and a half, you're going to have a full Active Directory recovery. An hour and a half if I configured all the domain controllers. This one should run a little bit quicker.
That sounds great, Dan. Almost as good and easy that a sales rep can do it, although I'd never trust myself to do that.
I'll give you the cut and paste information we can do. Everyone can do a forest recovery.
Perfect. All right. Thank you for showing us that, Dan. So while we still have the screen up and we can answer a couple of questions, let me read a few that's come through, okay?
Sure.
When do you think Active Directory will be completely phased out?
You can tell that I'm gray and bald, so when that happens, you won't be asking me that question. But we seriously thought Active Directory was due to be decommissioned 10 years ago with the release of Azure AD. But there were so many, Microsoft did such a good job of making Active Directory the de facto standard for on-prem authentication that they just couldn't, nobody can get away from it. Even if you wanted to move to, say, a hosted Entra or a hosted AD offering, you still have to migrate your Active Directory over. And that's not a simple task. So I think through attrition, used to be we wouldn't buy any applications that weren't Active Directory integrated. If you have Active Directory, you're going to authenticate to Active Directory. Now you don't really do that. You buy things that authenticate give you authentication options, whether it's, Entra ID for your primary authenticator, as most of us live on. But I think we've probably got another 7 or 8 years minimum of Active Directory use. It'll be around forever in some form, but for widespread use, I think 7 or 8 years is where we stand.
Very good. Thank you for that. Next question. How does a customer determine a recovery point for AD if they became impacted by ransomware?
That's a tough question. So, you just saw me recover Active Directory from last Friday. How do I know that it was good last Friday? Well, I don't. We've talking about, you mentioned threat scan. You mentioned scanning the backups for threats, for malware. That's a great solution to look at the actual file structures and things like that, so that you don't just recover AD with the same encryption algorithms or whatever it is in there. But one of the first steps you need to determine is your recovery point. So how do you do that? You can recover to clean room. You can run a quick recovery in a clean room. Obviously, if it's an encrypted machine or it's a totally junk, you probably didn't even have a backup for it. But if you recover it, you can take a look at it. Most Active Directory attacks were executed because there was a privilege escalation attack. So you can look at that recovered AD and see how the privilege escalation happened. Was it, the obscure admin SD holder reference, or was it something, somebody got into the domain admins group or something through some other means? We don't know. But you could take a look at that. You can clean up the groups before you go back to production environments.
I like it. Thank you. Is an Active Directory cold site useful?
Oh, we used to do these years ago. So when we worried about forest level corruption, right? So if you did a schema extension, say for you were upgrading to 2016. I don't know if that was really an upgrade. So you would put a domain controller, it could be right next to you, but it was in a separate Active Directory site and it only replicated once a week. Well, it was great. You could always go there and grab something from that schema, make that one authoritative and let it re-replicate back. Not a big deal. When we're talking about ransomware or major cyber events, you got to keep in mind that DC may only replicate once a week, but it's pulling group policy just about continuously. So if somebody puts something in a sysvol folder, it's going to replicate instantly to that DC and be able to be executed on that DC. So yes, they are very useful if you're talking about schema corruption or even authoritative restores when somebody deletes an OU full of users, but not really that useful anymore.
Very good. I'm sure you've seen it all, Dan. I mean, you and I have been on plenty of calls together where I've heard a lot in a short amount of time since we've had the product out, and you've done a great job in assuring a lot of customers that we've built a standout product here. A couple more. Does Entra ID have the same issues as Active Directory on-prem?
So from an Entra ID perspective, we don't do forest level recovery in Entra ID. There's no domain controllers to worry about. There's domain controllers, you just don't know where they are. So they're not really the same issue. You don't worry about force level corruption and that sort of thing from Entra ID. theoretically the tenant could be disbanded somehow, but we're not talking about recovery of the forest like would with on-prem Active Directory. Completely different animal. We're more worried about recovering the objects and attributes from a granular perspective, but those objects and attributes can impact things like how people authenticate. So I mentioned before, conditional access policies and admin groups and things like that.
Got it. Okay. Last question here, Dan, and I think this one, this person wanted to get a 2-for-1 because there's 2 questions in one, which I like. Should we run DCs in cloud infrastructure to reduce vulnerabilities? And what about Entra ID domain services?
You can run all of your domain controllers in cloud infrastructure. You can run all your domain controllers on-prem, or you can mix it back and forth. We see a lot of organizations that have a lot of cloud infrastructure because that's where the applications run. So you put DCs next to those applications on the same subnets. They still have the same vulnerabilities because the DC is not aware that it's in the cloud. I mean, somebody getting physical access to the domain controller is not going to happen, but accessing the application or getting to it the same way they would an on-prem DC, it's not really any different. Unless you do something like AWS Managed AD, and that's a different animal altogether. So, and then what was the second half of the question, Mike? It was...
Well, the second half is, what about Entra ID domain services?
Oh, well, I still know it as Azure AD Domain Services. So that was brought out with Azure AD. It's an interesting scenario where you've got an Active Directory running in Azure. It's running on their infrastructure. You can see the actual names of domain controllers. It's a service you can spin up, and it's designed so you can actually take Azure machines and join them to that domain, just like you would an on-prem Active Directory. But you don't have control over the whole directory. You don't get domain admin credentials, for instance. You have the right to join machines to the domain. I don't really see a lot of people using that because it's not that useful. So it's sort of a stopgap or a bridge to getting you to something like moving machines completely into Azure or into Entra ID. So we don't really protect that. We don't really have a force level recovery for that because the infrastructure actually lives for Microsoft.
Dan, thank you for answering those. I think we've come to the end of our time here. By the way, so we took maybe 8 or 10 minutes on those questionings. How far along are we on our process here of recovery?
We are still recovering the first DC, which will probably take another 15 to 20 minutes to recover that. It's going to reboot a couple of times, and then you'll really start seeing the forced recovery process run. You'll start clicking through all of these steps down here. So again, all it just pops up and says completed, nothing to see here, but underneath the covers, a forced recovery is actually happening.
Great stuff. Well, hopefully y'all found this as informative and interesting as we did. This was a monumental task for commvault to build this in the short amount of time that we did. Another standout product that is leading the category for us here. And if you liked it, hopefully hit the button where you can book a demo for you personally, for your account manager to come talk to you. And maybe Dan or myself might be on that call as well. Or please share out to friends, even family members that may like IT in general. I kid on that piece. But in general, forward to those that may need this. We'll get the link out to you as well. And if there are any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to Dan and myself via the links here or on LinkedIn as well. So we greatly appreciate you joining us today. We wish you to have a wonderful rest of your day or evening, depending on what time you're watching. And we appreciate you. Take care.